Doug called earlier and was all hysterical about voter fraud. Voter fraud doesn't pretty much exist in the United States. What does is election fraud. And I would submit to you that the almost 30 states in the United States where Republicans are running voter suppression efforts, that is election fraud. Not to mention the vulnerability of paperless voting systems that are just, clearly vulnerable to election fraud. So we have a serious fraud problem within our elections here in the United States. And I would say that, the epicenter of that problem is probably Kansas with Chris Kobach. Look at the extraordinary investigative reporting that Greg Palast has done. You can find it at gregpalast.com, PALAST.com, on, Chris Kobach's efforts in over 20 states, or collaboratively with the Republicans in 20 states, to knock people off the voting rolls if they have a common name. And the common names tend to be ethnic names. Greg said on this program, 80% of the people in the United States whose last name is Washington, for example, are black. And so, there seems to be a lot of Washingtons on Chris Kobach's list. And if there's a Washington in New Jersey and a Washington in Kansas, then we're going to assume that that's the same person and they're trying to illegally vote in both states. Even if the middle name is different, even if the birthday is different, even if the Social Security number is different. Actually, they're not even bothering to check Social Security numbers or middle names or telephone numbers, or it just goes on and on. So election fraud is a canard being used. It's a phony issue that has been ginned up by Republicans to give them the excuse to prevent American citizens of color, American citizens who are older and concerned about Medicare and Social Security, American citizens who are younger and concerned about college education and college debt and things like that, to prevent that, and tend to be more liberal than the average American, to prevent them from voting. And obviously to prevent people who live in cities. Cities tend to be more liberal than rural areas. And people who live in cities, particularly people of color, but generally speaking, everybody lives in cities who might not own a car, maybe never owned a car because there's public transportation, to prevent them from voting. It's very straightforward. Mother Jones has a piece. A person on Twitter pointed this out to me, or maybe it was one of the folks in the chat room. No, it must have been on Twitter. But in any case, it was from Mother Jones, and it was titled 9 Facts That Blow Up the Voter Fraud Myth. Number 1, the rate of fraud in U.S. elections is close to 0. Number 2, UFO sightings are more common than voter fraud. Number 3, getting struck by lightning. You're more likely to be struck by lightning than to encounter, or than to even discover, to identify a case of voter fraud. Number 4, Florida's aggressive efforts to root out voter fraud before the 2000 election erroneously purged 12,000 names from the voter rolls. Of the 12,000, 44%, more than 4,700 voters were African Americans. That was more than enough votes to change that year's presidential election, to put George Bush in the White House instead of Al Gore. So you can see how it's not voter fraud. It is, the voter fraud, voter fraud is this thing that has been made up by the Republican Party in order to provide cover to their efforts to prevent people, particularly African Americans or young people or elderly people, from voting. And it worked in 2000. Native Americans are fighting a slew of high-stakes legal battles over voting rights. Many of the lawsuits are linked to rules that were designed to so-called prevent voter fraud. Voter ID laws are among a host of hurdles that minorities face when they cast a ballot. A national voter ID card, this is where it gets really interesting, could eliminate the debate. Right? You want to have a debate on voter ID? Fine. Let's just have a national citizen registration card. Every citizen in the United, and make it like super easy, right? Like Meals on Wheels. The truck will come to your house and provide you with a voter ID. Now, when this was proposed back 20, 30 years ago, the Republicans got all hysterical about it. Well, a lot of Democrats did too. saying this is one step away from the papers, please state. And I kind of like the idea that I can walk down the street without any ID and still be in my country. I mean, it's just, but, you know, there were people who thought we should all have a national ID. If everybody had a national ID, that would be the end of that. And so now Republicans are opposed to the national ID for that reason. Oh my God, we can't have that. Republican presidential contender Ted Cruz's Iowa chairman spent $250,000 to stop people from voting, according to Mother Jones. Matt Schultz, the Iowa chairman. You can Google it. And interestingly, a conservative activist inadvertently demonstrated how hard it is to commit voter fraud by trying, this is James O'Keefe, he tried doing it and was unable. Now, meanwhile, this, I'm assuming that this is accurate. Sometimes assumptions are dangerous, but this is over at Democratic Underground. Hawaii hiker posted this, what to do if a poll watcher approaches you. See, Donald Trump, as he travels around the country, is encouraging his largely angry white audience to go into largely black neighborhoods. He did this most recently in Philadelphia, and harass voters to make sure that they're actually citizens. Right. And make sure that they're not voting 16 times, right, or whatever. So this this kind of little graphic that's floating around the internet right now. Voting is your right as a citizen. If an alleged poll watcher, in quotes, tries to impede you at the voting booth, number one, tell him to kindly step out of the way. Number two, take his picture with a cell phone. Number three, call the FBI. The FBI Civil Rights Division staff will be available by phone to receive complaints related to ballot access. And they've got the phone numbers there. But I think the take their picture with a cell phone part is like really important. This would be, you know, a fascinating addition to social media. I was harassed at the voting poll by this guy. It's called turnabout is fair play, right? You get in my face, I'm going to get in yours. Rick Scott doesn't even want people to register to vote, much less vote. Took a federal judge saying, oh, sorry, you had a hurricane. You got to extend your voting, you know, the window for voting registration by another week.